Hey kids, this is Dr. Russell coming at you this morning. Just want to take some time this morning to talk with you about the changes that are coming to the 2020 administration of the AP US History test and what that test is going to look like. And of course, you've probably heard by now that that test is the DBQ. This is, I think, generally good news. It's never ideal when a test is you're being tested in a situation that's as uncertain as all this is right now with COVID-19. But the DBQ is the format that is unique to AP history courses and is something that you are familiar with if you've taken WAP or maybe AP Euro or something like that in the past. So I want to talk about that. For the most part, it really hasn't changed much. In some courses for the AP administration this year, there were a lot of changes, and it was very confusing. Thankfully, for the history courses, it's really pretty straightforward. The test this year will just be the DBQ for APUSH and WAP and AP Euro, that's more. Those are because the format for those three courses are more or less the same. In terms of how the test works. Now, what is different is, of course, that there is no multiple choice or short answer or long essay. It's just the DBQ, and you have a shorter amount of time, right? As opposed to a 15-minute reading period to kind of read and sort your documents and sort of plan your essay, and then 45 minutes to write. You have 45 minutes total, right? So you've basically cut into the writing time by 10 to 15 minutes, right? Now, because of that, they have shortened the requirement for the number of documents that you need to use, and they've sort of changed up some of that stuff, and they've changed up the way the scoring this year on the rubric. Typically, the DBQ is scored on a 7-point rubric, and this year it will be scored on a 10-point rubric. That's good because it gives you more opportunities to earn those points. Now, I can't honestly say if I get 3 points, does that count, on the DBQ, is that a 3 on the AP exam? I don't know the scaling and the scoring. We won't really know that until those of us who are AP readers go to do the reading this summer. That's a question for May. Right, I suspect not, because that there'll be some scaling or some mathematic formula they'll apply for the number of points you get here equals this overall score on the exam over here. What that will look like, we don't know. Right, what we do know is what the rubric looks like. So that's what I want to talk to you about today, and what I want to spend some time with. So I'm going to put the rubric up on the screen here, and then I'm just going to kind of talk through it so that you can get a sense of how you're being scored and what's changed and what hasn't. Okay, so I'm going to put that up here if this stupid technology thing will comply with me. Right, let me see here. I'm just going to share my whole screen. We'll put this up. I'll square this one, and then we'll put this up here. Okay, so this is the APUSH rubric for 2020. This is what you should be seeing on your screen. Hopefully, I'm not screwing this up. All right, and kind of what this looks like, and how this will go. Right, and you'll note that here it says 10 points. Right, that's a big change, but again, one that's in your favor. Now, you'll note that the first couple of points here haven't changed at all, right? This is your thesis point, right, and your contextualization point. All right, I want to talk about these in order, and then we'll kind of put some of it together, maybe. Right, now, first is thesis, right? Because if you don't have a thesis, you don't have an essay, right? You have a word jumble. Right, a thesis is what gives purpose to an essay. I like somebody, an English teacher one time that I worked with, taught me that a simple little mathematic formula, if you will, for the thesis. She said, argument plus reason equals thesis, right? So if you cannot make an arguable statement, right, then you do not have a thesis. The sky is blue is not a thesis. That is plainly evident. You can look out the window and see it. It's a little gray and overcast today, but you kind of get my point. It's not really a thing that can be. There's not a position. There's no to what degree, in what sense, in certain context, right? History is not a business of absolute. Very few things in the human condition are. So it is a so if there's not some room for some nuance, then you don't really, it's really hard to make an argument. And if you can't make an argument, and I don't mean like in the sense of, shouting at people on social media kind of argument. I mean like, the crux of a point and our argument in the classic rhetorical sense, right? If you don't have that argument, then you don't really have anything to support, right? My statement, or just a second ago, where I said the sky is blue, what evidence do I need to offer to support that? It's self-evident, right? To borrow language from the Declaration of Independence, right? It's very clear. It's not really, you can't really formulate anything around it. Okay. So if you'll look over here on the decision rules, I think this is a really useful thing for you to break down. I like to look at a rubric with students so that they understand how they're going to be assessed, right? It says the thesis, right, must make a claim that responds to the prompt rather than restating or rephrasing it. Okay. In other words, you have to actually say something. You have to take a position. Okay. If the question is about, to what extent did John Adams violate his responsibility as president, or his responsibility to the Constitution and to constitutional principle, with the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts, you can, there's to what extent is what gives you the room to argue. If you say, did he violate the Constitution? Yes or no, right? That's not really arguable, right? And you can't say things like, well, in some ways he did, in some ways he didn't. You don't want to be wishy-washy, and you don't want to just restate the prompt. Because remember, the prompt won't be phrased as a question, it'll be phrased as a statement. If you just restate that, you're not really saying anything, right? Now, you'll notice that the next thing here is the thesis consists of one or more sentences located in one place, either in the introduction or the conclusion. I have always felt that this is misleading on the part of the College Board, and I'm going to tell you right now that your thesis needs to be in the introduction to your essay. Very few people are good enough writers to hook somebody from the beginning and keep them reading and then have the thesis at the end of an essay, right? You don't want the big reveal at the end. This isn't a murder mystery. This isn't Knives Out, right? That's not what you're doing here, right? You need to be clear up front what your essay is about. So your thesis should be in the introduction, and in a well-structured essay, it should be the last sentence of the introductory paragraph, okay? Everything in the introductory paragraph should build to the thesis, right? Now, a paragraph is usually 3 to 4 sentences, so that last sentence is your thesis, clearly, concisely stated, right? Here's my position, here's the reasons why. Sometimes that's done, I use the John Adams example. John Adams violated constitutional principle with the Alien and Sedition Act by suppressing the press and in direct violation of the First Amendment to the Constitution, and by imprisoning some of his political enemies, right? Those are reasons. Right, I've given reasons to support my argument. You have to provide those. Those reasons also then can become the topics for your body paragraphs. Right, I've now got the basis for 2 really solid body paragraphs. In one of those paragraphs, I'm going to talk about how he violated the First Amendment by suppressing the press, and then in the second, I'm going to talk about how he violated constitutional principle by imprisoning his political enemies when they may or may not have committed a crime other than criticizing the president, which of course is not a crime in our system, right? It's tyrannical, right? So you could really make those arguments. Now I've really got something to work with when I get into the body paragraphs. Okay. So if the thesis then is the last sentence of the opening paragraph, then the other sentences, the other 2 to 3 sentences of that opening paragraph from the first word of the essay until you start your thesis, that's really where your contextualization comes in. Okay. And this is a point that students miss all the time, right? Because contextualization gets confused with, excuse me, sophistication, or with complexity or something like that, or you get in such a hurry that you just forget to include this. Let me say that more times than not, that is the case in my experience. You know what you're talking about, and it seems so obvious to you that you start talking about it, and then you start saying, okay, well, this thing, and you just assume that everybody else does, right? The contextualization point is lost because you just work from the assumption that everybody knows what you're talking about. Here's the rule of thumb on this, right? Always assume that your readers are intelligent but uninformed on the topic. Now, obviously, the AP graders are all history teachers. They know this stuff, but that's what they're looking for you to be able to do that, to relate the topic. Here's the language to the broader historical events or developments or processes that occur before, during, or continue after the time frame of the question. Again, this is a place where I don't love the College Board's language, so let me simplify that, right? What happened that led up to the thing that you're about to talk about in the rest of your essay? That's context, right? Historical context. When in doubt, College Board and AP, they love to use all these acronyms. The HIP. What's the author's intent? What's a document I wish I had? What's this? You're historians, right? By the 11th grade, you should be writing in a more sophisticated fashion when you write history. And the answer and the correct context, the correct sophistication, if you will, in any situation is historical context, right? That's what we do, right? That's what history is, right? Understanding what has come before and how it informs, how events lead to each other, right? I've always said that the study of history is not the study of the past, right? It is the study of the present and how we got here, right? If you keep that in mind, then what you are keeping in mind is historical context. Well, how do we get to this? If I'm writing about John Adams and his presidency in 1797 or 1798, well, what happened before? Right? Why is John Adams in a situation where he feels like he needs to pass the Alien and Sedition Acts? George Washington didn't have to do that, right? Mostly that's because, George Washington was a boss and maybe John Adams was not as much, it's hard to follow George Washington, or whatever the case may be. But that context is important, right? Here's another and very, very, very important piece. If you don't remember anything else I say about context this morning, right? If the prompt mentions dates, so should your opening paragraph. Your context must mention dates. John Adams did some stuff during his presidency. What's that have to do with anything, right? That's not context. It's not deep. But if the prompt says from his presidency from 1797 to 1798, for example, in those 2 years, and you start talking about stuff that he did later in, if you start talking about the midnight judges in 1800, right, just before Jefferson takes over, you're outside of the framework of what the essay is asking you, right? So you need to mention specifically those dates. If dates are mentioned in an essay prompt, they must show up in your essay, and they need to be in that opening paragraph. I cannot stress that enough. Okay, that's contextualization. You need that what has happened that has led up to to the moment that you're about to write about. Okay. That's what you need to do. All right, so let's move on to the evidence portion. Now, the evidence portion for a DBQ is where the bulk of the points are in any given year, but there are a lot of them associated with it this year. 5 potential points that you can earn here. And they've added a couple of things. And I like this particular rubric that I'm showing you on the screen because you can see where they've added the points. This is directly from the College Board, and what they're telling you is 2020 only. So you can see the things that are highlighted in green are the things that they are just adding this year, right? So usually what happens is that you will have a set of documents for a DBQ. There will be 6 or 7, and the rule is you use all or all but one. Okay, it's becomes the catchphrase for typically that you have 6 or 7 documents use. So if you've got to use all or all but one, you use 6 or 7. You have to use at least 6 of them. right? Or 5 if there are only 6. It depends. It kind of floats from year to year. Are there 5 or are there 6? This year there will be 5 documents. We know this. This is what the College Board has told us. And you will, to get full points, you have to use at least 4 of them, right? All but one. You know, there you go. That's math. There's a cross-curricular lesson for you this morning, kids. All right. So to do that, you start kind of breaking out how you get these points. So if you get into this thing and you wade in here and you start kind of looking at the content. If you use the content of at least 2 documents, okay, right, you are getting a point. Right now, that's not a lot of points. And the usage of a document is not a terribly sophisticated thing. Like, oh, I've mentioned the document. By the way, when you mention the document, don't say in the text of your essay, you do never write according to document A or a document C, right? In a letter from John Adams to Thomas Jefferson, you know, whatever, reference it by its name or whatever, but it sounds very sophomoric to say according to document C or document A. It's bad writing. But at the end, you should include a little parenthetical citation that says document A, right? The way you'd cite a reference in the body of your research paper. Kind of the same thing here, right? If you do that, that means that your reader doesn't have to guess, and they don't have to look for it. Oh, I can count 1, 2. Oh, here's 3 and 4. Oh, I've got this student has used 4 documents. Right. I know that you've at least included information from 4 documents. I know you can read, and I know that you can look at these documents. That's something. You're off and running, and you've got some points on the board. Okay, that's really, really important. Consider that the APUS history test is the most widely given test. Over 300,000 students take it every single year, and this year the grading is going to be especially wonky because it has to be all done online, and everything has to be read twice. Right. So if I get a stack of essays to grade during the grading week, and there won't be a stack of them, they'll come electronically, and I read one and I say, okay, well, I'm giving this point here and I'm giving this point here. Somebody else somewhere else will have to read that, and our scores have to line up. Okay, because that's called inter-rater reliability, and it's so that it's fair to you, so that one person is just, one old crazy history teacher just sitting there like, oh, I hate this essay, this is stupid, I don't agree with the point. It's not a question of agreement. It's a question of how well do you support it, right? So that there's, that's kind of a safety net that exists for you. Okay, so you've got to using the documents, but note the language for the second point, right? The green point, and what I'm going to call the green point here, because it's the sort of the added one here for this year, right? You support an argument in response to the prompt using 2 documents, right? Again, this is not just using information. You get a point for using some information. If you reference the document and, hey, here it says this, okay, in the document, John Adams, says such and such and such and such. By the way, paraphrase, don't quote. In history, that's the general rule of thumb, right? Because when you paraphrase instead of quoting, it shows that you understand what's being said. You're lending yourself to sophistication. Right. If you just quote, especially if it's an older text, something from the 1800s or the late 1700s or something, right? That language is confusing, so it shows your reader that you can regurgitate. But if you can paraphrase, you can put it in your own words. You can synthesize. You understand what's being said. It's more sophisticated. Paraphrase. Do not quote. Right. So if you look at this the second point in green, right? It's not just about using the document, like using information from the document. It's about supporting your argument, right? Now, I made 2 sort of supporting arguments of my central thesis that, John Adams behaved inappropriately in my example. And I'll do another video where we kind of walk through and kind of put some of this stuff out, kind of maybe lay some things out where you can see it visually. But if you think about this, like you're supporting the argument. You're not just citing information from the document, you're actually using it to support your thesis. That's important. You get a second point there. If you use 2 documents and use them really well in a way that supports your argument, you've got 2 of the 3 points and only used 2 documents. Okay, that's pretty awesome. That's a check in you're in the plus column for you. That you're getting those points. Now, to get that third point, you need to do those things with 4 of the documents. Okay, that's so that's again we come back to the all or all but one, right? So 2 of the 3 points happen off of only 2 documents here in terms of evidence, right? Now that's pretty awesome. Okay, now also in the DBQ, you'll remember that you have to have information that is sometimes called information not present in the documents, or outside information, or evidence beyond the documents. They kind of change up the verbiage every few years about how we reference it. I've always said outside information, but evidence beyond the documents is how we're saying it now. I'm trying to break myself of the old of saying it in the old way. Okay. So let's consider that for a second. Evidence beyond the documents is usually thought of as one significant piece of outside information, specific historical evidence that's not present in the document, right? So if you're writing about John Adams and the Alien Sedition Acts and how people react to that, and there isn't a document that specifically references the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that Thomas Jefferson writes sort of kind of on the sly under an assumed name, right? Then, and you talk about that and the effect that had on the way people thought about the Alien Sedition Act. That's outside information. That's not in the documents. You've shown that you remembered something from history class, right? This is kind of what this is. This is the outside evidence here. So by using that, and I would just cite it as evidence beyond, with a little parenthetical at the end, just in parentheses at the end of the sentence. You don't have to do that, but it's a nice courtesy to your reader, right? If you've got that, typically you need one piece of that in any given in any other year where you were taking the APUSH exam. You need one piece of additional information outside of the documents to sort of support this, to get this point. Now they've given you an opportunity for a second point, right? If you can do that with 2 pieces of specific historical evidence outside the documents, outside information, if you will, right? Then you can earn a second point here. So if we back up here and we look at these total of 5 points, if you can just use a couple of documents and then use them to actually in a way that supports your thesis, and then you have just one single piece of outside historical evidence that's not in the documents that you can use to support your argument, right? That's not a lot of stuff, and you've got 3 of the 5 points that you can get in category C, in the evidence category. That's pretty remarkable, right? You've got a real shot here to really do well here, right? You increase to 4 documents, y'all, and a couple of pieces of outside information. That's nothing, right? You can do this, right? You're talking, this is a big chunk of the points here, right? Now obviously, now think about the way this comes together. If you can use it to support an argument, that means that you've made an argument. So you've already, at the least, if you can hit your thesis thing, and then you can support your thesis with a little bit of evidence, which is kind of what 11th grade is about, kind of what you spend a lot of your 11th grade class learning to do, right? You're already at 5-6 points pretty easy. If you're doing this right, and just, stopping, breathing, planning. Remember to take a few minutes to read the documents and plan out what you're going to say, right? So then you've got your evidence category. Now our next category is analysis and reasoning. Now this is where, for those of you who took WAP, this is where the HIP thing used to come. People used to talk about the HIP, and I hate that particular thing because I feel like you become so connected to that format. Well, am I looking for all the HIP things that you forget to write well? The document's point of view, its purpose, those are all valid things. I just encourage you to think about these things a little bit more organically. I hate the acronym because I feel like I feel like it mystifies a thing that really shouldn't be, right? Note that the document's point of view, purpose, historical situation, or audience is relevant to the argument over here in the decision rules. But note this language right here. Let me highlight that better. The historical situation, guys, that's historical context, right? When in doubt, historical context. Okay, that will always be the thing that will always be the thing that saves you, right? The document's point of view. I think this is sort of just in pure scholarly terms, I think it can be kind of dubious, right? The document's point of view is you're kind of trying to get at authorial intent. And in some cases, we know that. If we're looking at the Declaration of Independence, we kind of know what Thomas Jefferson's point of view is, and we know what the purpose is, and we know who his intended audience is, right? We could even get so sophisticated as to talk about his immediate audience, his secondary audience, right? And the tertiary argument, our audience for this sort of thing. I mean, that's for a great historical document, you're going to have that sort of thing. But the historical situation is where you can really drill into the sophistication in a way that makes sense for historians, right? That's always going to be, when in doubt, go with historical situation. And when you see historical situation, that's the same thing as historical context. Now, that's not the same thing as the contextualization in the opening paragraph, right? The contextualization in the opening paragraph is what has led up to this moment that you're about to talk about in your essay, right? What has happened before this. Now, the historical context or historical situation of what you talk about in the essay is the ramifications of those events themselves. Like, what is the effect of the Alien Sedition Act? What is the effect of the Virginia and Kentucky Resolution? What effect does it have on the election of 1800? What does Jefferson do about it once he's the president? Like, there's some different ways that you can approach that, right? If you can do that for one document, okay, you're getting one of these points. And if you can do it for the second one, for a second document, then you're going to get a second point here. So if we back up here to the 3 possible points here that we had in the evidence category up under C, right? And we talked about how many documents do you use? Let's say you only use 2 documents in this thing. Let's say that you just struggle. I do not read that as an endorsement of the idea of only using 2 documents. You want to try to get as many points here as possible, right? But if you're struggling and you've got two and you've used them well, so you've used information here, you've got 1 point, right? You've used it to support an argument, there's your second point, right? You come down here, and for both of those documents, you can talk about the historical situation, or their historical significance, the historical context in which they're written, and what they sort of speak to. That's 4 points, right, off of 2 documents. Then you add in your outside information, 2 pieces of outside information, you've got 6 points. Okay, you got your thesis in there, you've got 7, right? Right, context. You get you to 8. See where I'm going? This is not insurmountable. This can really be done well. This is not a thing to have to freak out about. Now, the last thing here that we need to kind of consider is the complexity point, right? What they call the complexity point. This last sort of point on here. This is the difference between a great essay and a perfectly functional one, right? You have to demonstrate a complex understanding of the historical development that is the focus of the prompt, right? I think this is a really this is a nebulous sort of a thing to try to explain to students, what do we mean by complexity? So let me demystify it for the when in doubt situation. Over here are some examples of ways that you could demonstrate complexity, the nuance of an issue, looking at multiple variables, similarities and differences. This is continuity and change, right? Change over time. That's the like how, what does this do? So this is like we used to talk about this in terms of analysis, right? Always change over time, right? Now, the easiest way, now again, this language that you're seeing on the screen can be a little bit confusing, because when you talk about continuity and change, the best way to do that, right, is through connections within and across time periods. Okay, so if you can talk about how if you can show the sort of the continuity. Remember, continuity can't be shown out of chronological order, right? That's important. Put things in order. It's a simple way to do this, right? If you talk about something in 1797 and you're going to talk about something in 1798 and then something in 1799, don't put them out. Put them in chronological order. One thing leads to another. That's how time passes, and that's how history works. Okay, so make sure that you have that chronological order, and it will help you have that continuity and change over time. Now, I'm also going to show you, I'm also going to talk to you a couple of practical tips. Do this in the text. Do this continuity and change thing. Now, if the prompt is clearly a similarities and differences, if it's compare and contrast or whatever, then obviously you're going to use a more similarities and differences kind. But more times than not, APUSH will ask for continuity and change over time. They want to see that. That's what history is. That's the study of that. Now, this has the added benefit. You can reinforce this in your essay, right? You should see this throughout the essay. You should be able to say this, how this thing leads to this thing leads to the next thing, right? You should be able to say that. If you talk about the Alien Sedition Acts and you say this, this caused Thomas Jefferson to write the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions in response because he's concerned about the tyranny that John Adams is sort of displaying, and then this set up the election of 1800 where it was Jefferson versus Adams, and this led then to Adams's unpopularity and Jefferson becoming the third president. You could do that. See, I did that in chronological order, right? That should happen in the body of your essay. But here's a great tip, right? This is an awesome way to tie up an essay, right? Because you get to the conclusion, people say, do you need a conclusion? Well, yeah, you do need a conclusion, right? A conclusion is a part of an essay. It's not entirely coherent without one. Now, the conclusion is not as important as analysis, and it's not as important as the thesis and the context because you're not being awarded points for it. But you don't just leave it off, right? Some 10th grade history teachers will kind of teach you to do that, and that's bad teaching. That's a terrible way to do this. You need a conclusion, but a lot of times people struggle with, well, what do I say, right? So you get down to, so you've written this otherwise really great essay, and you get down to the bottom and you get this paragraph that just is like, in conclusion, and they're like, oh my God, what is this mess, right? It just kind of undoes an otherwise really, never use the phrase in conclusion, right? It's just, if you have to tell me it's the conclusion, it's not a good conclusion, right? Here's how to write a good conclusion. Connect whatever you're talking about in your essay to now, right? It's not appropriate to talk about an overreaching federal government in the post 9/11 world or during the period of COVID-19 or whatever. That would not be appropriate in the body of an essay, right? If you're talking about a historical context, but if you're talking about the comparison of events in the past with the present, that's a great way to write it. That's a great way to show some sophistication and some complexity, and to write a really solid conclusion to your paragraph, because you are conveying, because it kind of wraps everything up nicely, and you're conveying to the reader that you understand history, that you understand how history affects the present, because that's what, remember what I said history is about. History is the study of the present and how we got here, right? It works every time. It's a really simple, really straightforward way to write about the past with something you already kind of know about. Right? You know about the present. I mean, you see things around you. Make a connection to modern day. It technically wouldn't even have to be modern day. You could say, well, maybe the federal government overreached during the Great Depression and during the New Deal or something. You could maybe make that argument, or or didn't, or that John Adams established precedents for the presidency that maybe weren't good or were good or whatever. Like, if you can connect it to a later time period, that always works. And you can always connect to the present because we know about the present. Okay. That's a perfectly appropriate way to conclude an essay. That should not be in the body. It should not read anything outside of the historical context established by the prompt itself in the essay, but in the body of the essay. But in the conclusion, it's okay to talk about that, and it makes a connection, and it actually really works in your favor. So if you don't really know what to say in your conclusion, it's a solid one, right? I just can't stress that enough. It's a way to help kind of put you over the top on this complexity point. A good conclusion alone will not get you this complexity point, but it's really hard to get the complexity point without a good conclusion, if that makes sense, okay? All right, so I'm going to stop sharing here, and hopefully this all recorded correctly. Okay, so I hope that this has been of some benefit to you. I want to do some. I'm going to do some future videos where we maybe I'll put something up on the screen with an actual prompt, and we can kind of walk through and kind of apply this. But I think first and foremost, understand the rubric and understand how you're going to be assessed, and you'll go pretty far in terms of doing well on this thing. The good news is that 11th grade history and English, it stresses it's writing, it's writing, it's writing, it's writing, it's writing. And this is a written test. So you can do this. The DBQ is a formula that we can crack, okay? If you're writing well, we just have to understand how to apply the formula so that you can kind of jump the AP hoop to get the points that you need this year. I know you'll all be great at this. And if you have questions, talk to your teachers. If you have questions for me, talk to your teachers, and they can tell you, and they can put you in touch with me, and I'll be glad to answer anything that you have directly by email or whatever. Okay, you guys have a great day.